Okay, and I think we are now recording again. So welcome back, everyone. If you are watching this live, welcome. It is currently the last presentation that we have for the month of August. Thank you all so much for following along with our summer virtual training series. If you are watching this later on our YouTube channel, we will have more content coming out throughout the rest of 2020, so please keep your eyes peeled out for that. And again, thank you all just so much for being participants in our kind of relatively new way of getting information out to people. So again, if you are tuning in for the first time, my name is Kira. I am the Substance Use Prevention Coordinator for the City of Somerville, and I've been facilitating a series of different trainings throughout the month of August on different types of substances. Last week, we had a training on anger management and substance use. Today, in our last presentation, we are actually going to be discussing alcohol. So let's get started. Again, have a couple of different training objectives here. We'll be going into some of the biology and history of alcohol use and dependency, consequences of alcohol use, treatment resources, youth prevention, other resources, and again, time at the end for Q&A. So if you are part of our live audience tonight, please feel free to submit questions and comments into the chat box. We're going to have a couple of moments throughout the presentation where we will be asking the audience for questions. So please feel free to submit, and let's go ahead and get started. So I think from a social standpoint, most of us have a pretty good idea of what alcohol is, but more formally, we can consider drinkable alcohol as ethyl alcohol, which is also known in turn as ethanol. This is in turn the intoxicating ingredient that we find in most modern forms of alcohol today. It's the creation of it's created by the fermentation of yeast, sugar, and starch, and often it is found in combination with other ingredients, things like hops and barley, wheat, rice, herbs, various different other types of spices and food ingredients. So in terms of alcohol, like many of the other substances that we've talked about in our virtual training series thus far, humanity has a particularly long history with alcohol. We have some evidence to indicate that we have been consuming alcohol for about possibly 9,000 years. We have some archaeological evidence from about 7,000 BC from China. And then obviously we have many different types of alcohol throughout history and across continents too, which is very interesting. We have evidence of alcohol being drunk not only in Asia, but also in Mesopotamia. We have a lot of evidence that the Greeks, the Romans, and the Egyptians were all pretty frequent drinkers. We have evidence of alcohol being drunk in cultures throughout Northern Europe, Africa, and also even in Mesoamerica, which is now kind of modern day Central and South America. Alcohol, for the most part, we tend to think of it as being a beverage that is drunk on a purely social basis. However, there also have been a lot of other purposes for alcohol throughout the millennia, including spiritual ceremonies, medicinal purposes, ceremonial purposes. I think one of the things that we can still see today in our culture is communion, for instance, and drinking wine as part of Mass if you happen to be Catholic. And, you know, even just at a purely social level, there are so many instances in which alcohol is really taken on a kind of, not exactly a ceremonial purpose, but almost a rite of passage purpose. You know, for instance, in modern history, people who are turning 21 for the first time and legally, you know, being able to have that first drink. We have alcohol being served at most formal occasions and even most casual social occasions, whether that be sports games to formal events like weddings, funerals, birthday parties, bar mitzvahs, christenings. The list really does go on. So for all intensive purposes, we are now pretty much a species that alcohol has kind of just become a very normal part of our functioning, and it's really just kind of ingrained itself into many different aspects of our culture. So what exactly does alcohol do? Now, I think most people would typically say to me, oh, I drink alcohol because I want to relax, or I want to have a good time. I want to just kind of take, relax after a long, hard day of work. So we tend to think of alcohol as being something that kind of gives us a little bit more of a stimulant type effect, meaning that we're looking for it to improve our mood and to make us feel better and to make us relax. However, alcohol is actually primarily a depressant. In other words, the more you drink, the more it's going to slow down the function of your brain, which is why when we see people who have had quite a bit of alcohol, we start to notice things like their speech starts to slur. We start to notice things like your balance starts to get thrown off. You're kind of wobbling from side to side. Your reaction time definitely slows down. And there's also a lot of changes to your perceptions, especially in various different social situations. In other words, however, really what it comes down to is, ironically, although we are really drinking alcohol for that stimulant type effect, it actually, in the long run, is always going to be more of a depressant, and it is always going to be a substance that eventually goes down the road of being a depressant, no matter what sort of stimulant effects we feel in the short term. So here are a couple of other things that I would like to point out, just in terms of the differences between a depressant versus, say, a stimulant. With depressants, again, we also notice a couple of other things happening as well, such as your heart rate starts to slow down, your breathing rate also decreases, which, is also in turn kind of tied into heart rate, since the heart and the lungs have so much to do with spreading oxygen throughout your body. On a purely neurological basis, messages from the brain to the muscles are a lot slower. Your arms and legs can't move as well. And the result of that is basically your body is not able to quickly respond to any situation, but also importantly, it's not able to respond to any sorts of dangerous situations quickly. And unfortunately, we have many different examples of that, especially that's everything ranging from drunk driving accidents to people becoming intoxicated and unfortunately putting themselves into a variety of different and unsafe situations, both whether they're alone or around other people. So here is an interesting little medieval picture that we have on the side here. Again, I believe this is an Irish monk from around the 13th century, drinking some beer. Most drinks, similar to how we talked about a few weeks ago about how marijuana has changed quite a bit in terms of its content and the genetic makeup of it, so too has the alcohol content in our beverages gone up. We have beer, which is I'd say probably one of the most commonly consumed forms of alcohol, and that generally has about a 2 to 6% level of alcohol content in it. So on a scale of least to highest, beer still kind of falls down into that lower category, as well as cider. Then you start to slowly move up the ladder, and wine, again, a very historical drink that we have been consuming for thousands of years. Typically nowadays, it's somewhere in the 8 to 20% alcohol content range. And then we have all of the other forms of alcohol, which I would say are definitely slightly more recent in terms of our drinking culture: tequila, rum, brandy, whiskey, vodka, liqueurs, and liqueurs having probably next to vodka and whiskey, probably some of the strongest and highest levels of alcohol content. And because we have seen so many changes in terms of alcohol content throughout the centuries, we are now looking at alcohol as something that has some pretty substantial consequences potentially attached to it that we might not have seen, say, 1,000 years ago, or maybe even 500 years ago. Although I think I can make the argument pretty strongly that alcohol has not always been purely just a recreational beverage of choice. It is something that we have seen many different worrying signs of abuse throughout history. So I'm going to take a moment to just quickly stop and again turn to our chat box and just turn to the audience and ask, what are a couple of warning signs that you think of when you think of alcohol use kind of veering into more of that dependent or not healthy type of alcohol consumption? So I'm going to give people a couple of seconds, and then we're going to read off some answers from people. So I'm seeing here from one person in the chat box, having a difficult time stopping. Yeah, absolutely. I have another person who agrees with that and is also pointing out that you might be spending a lot more time during the day or on your weekends drinking. Absolutely. And that can really depend on the person and everything from finances to work schedule and how much accessibility they have to it. And we also have another person in the chat box saying that they think that waking up with hangovers, yeah, that possibly, yeah, that could definitely be one potential option as well. Although I think it is possible to definitely drink and have a hangover and have it be a very isolated incident. Although having it on a pretty chronic basis could be a sign of something worrying. So thank you all for sharing. So let's kind of get into a couple of other ones. The biggest warning sign that we tend to think of in the health realm is tolerance, meaning that you are developing more of a tolerance to the amount of alcohol that you can drink at one given time. So for instance, someone who is just taking their first drink of alcohol ever, they might have half a beer and feel incredibly intoxicated. And then we flash forward maybe 15 years later, and they are someone who is drinking on a even semi-regular, just purely social basis. And at that point, they're able to maybe drink 3 to 4 beers over the course of 5 hours and not really feel too many heavy symptoms of alcohol intoxication at that point. And that's because, again, their body has become a lot more tolerant of alcohol in the system. Withdrawal symptoms, and this is something that we are going to go into a lot more depth on a little bit later on. Having the desire to stop drinking, but not being able to, even though you may really want to. Isolating while using, definitely a huge factor here. I am always reminded of a client who I worked with several years ago who was struggling to put down alcohol, who would just put himself into this really incredible situation where he would end up working for months at a time. And then when he had saved up enough money to have a room, he would basically find a room. It didn't matter what the quality of the room was, but just find a small room pretty much right next to or right above a liquor store. And while they had the money, he would just buy alcohol and just drink and drink and drink and drink. And he did this completely alone. There were no friends around him. There was no family or no significant other around him. He just would hole up in that room and just drink until, his funds ran out, basically. So for me, isolation is definitely a major factor when it comes to warning signs. And this also kind of ties into our next thing right here, which is neglecting other aspects of your life. And that really runs a very broad spectrum. Stopping hobbies, not paying attention to family or other relationships, not going into work or showing up super, super late on a pretty consistent basis. Neglecting different parts of your career, schooling, your health, that's an especially big one. We're going to get into that a little bit later as well. And also just ignoring financial difficulties, and really, again, the list goes on and on and on. There are also a lot of negative consequences that can become quite chronic issues, especially if you are struggling with ongoing substance use, and in this case, particularly alcohol use. For instance, I have worked with several clients who have been referred to me by the legal system because they were either caught with DUIs and were put into the legal system and referred out for treatment as a result of that. You have a lot of medical consequences attached to long-term alcohol misuse, which again, we will get into a little bit later on in the course of today's presentation. And I think most importantly, there are so many personal life consequences, which kind of come to the neglect that starts to build up in the early stages of becoming more abusive of your alcohol intake, especially with relationships with other people. And then especially for youth, and we are going to have a section at the end of this presentation talking about some youth prevention aspects, changes to mood, difficulties with school and at home, changes in friendships, really decreased involvement in former interests, especially extracurricular activities, a huge increase in irritability, sometimes mood swings, and again, just a lot more what we would call kind of, I guess, acting out behaviors. Which then leads to the very interesting question, what exactly is it that eventually leads to alcohol use and dependency? And when I'm referring to the term alcohol use, I am not necessarily referring to someone who is a responsible social drinker who is maybe having a drink or two a couple of nights a week, a glass of wine with dinner, or someone who maybe has 2 or 3 drinks on the weekend going out to see friends. I'm talking about someone who is definitely starting to struggle with their alcohol intake. There are many different aspects that go into this. I do think that pre-existing mental health issues tend to make up a pretty huge part of alcohol use becoming more dependent in nature. There are also a lot of comorbid medical diagnoses that can eventually lead to alcohol use. A lot of the people who I have worked with definitely fall into this category, and that would be recent or chronic history of trauma and or stress. And this is a huge factor right here, the genetic and environmental family / community history of addiction. One of the things that's really interesting about this is, although alcoholism is something that we can look at and frame very specifically within the context of just that individual's life, if you have someone who is growing up in an environment where alcohol is very regularly being abused in front of a child, there are so many environmental factors that go into that. I have a lot of clients who, when they were children, for instance, would be sent to go to the liquor store around the corner and bring home a 6-pack or a 12-pack from mom and dad. And obviously that now has changed quite a bit. It is totally illegal to do that. But 30, 40 years ago, it was quite common in some neighborhoods and within some communities. That was just kind of a normal thing that happened. Alcohol abuse within parents, and also even within grandparents and great-grandparents, can actually lead to a certain level of genetic changes being inherited throughout the generations. Let's say if you have one family where you have a great-grandparent who started to drink on a very heavy, regular basis, what they are passing on to their child at that point, in particular, if they started to have this alcohol dependency issue before they actually had a child, that child is then going to in turn inherit a stronger tolerance for alcohol, meaning that they're going to have to drink more in order to feel that impact. Now, that doesn't necessarily lead to a guaranteed alcohol use dependency issue later on in life. But if you throw in the environmental factors as well, you just see this thing kind of being passed down, again, from generation to generation to generation. And even if it's not your family, your immediate family that is raising you, we also have to look at just the community that is surrounding that particular individual as well. I have, again, worked with a lot of clients who, contrary to some of the other people who I've worked with for whom alcohol was just a very consistent part of their lives growing up in their family units, I have several people who I've worked with as clients who grew up in families where substance use was just not something that was a factor. It was not something that was ever present before, but it was something that was a major part of the community and the neighborhoods that they lived in. And for a variety of different personal reasons, they just kind of ended up spending more time out in the community than they did at home. So definitely, whether it's family or the area that you are living in at that time, definitely there's some major factors there. Self-medication kind of ties into a couple of different aspects, actually, of some of the things that we've mentioned here. There is, I think, a huge desire to want to feel good, especially in time periods where you are just really, really struggling And mind you, there are any number of different ways that people can go about doing that. But the more complex the issue, the more it may be likely for some people to want to reach out to drink alcohol, to just feel better, to forget for a moment, to just, again, to relax. And again, this could be due to chronic issues. It could be due to a more recent issues. You know, self-medication does not necessarily have to apply only to, say, a veteran who has just come home from doing a couple of tours in the Middle East, who is drinking as a form of self-medication due to combat post-traumatic stress. You could also, and this is something that's, you know, a very cultural kind of norm at this point, and also in some ways a stereotype. You also have, you know, for one example, a breakup. You know, someone could have just gone through a very bad breakup with their partner, and as a means of coping, they turn to alcohol for a little while. You know, whether that is drinking a bottle of wine at home or being taken out by friends to go drink at a bar on a super regular basis just to kind of quote unquote, oh, let's cheer you up, let's go out. So again, self-medication, there's a variety of different meanings attached to that. This is something that we will also talk about a little bit later on in the presentation, the availability and the legality of alcohol. In my mind, puts it at such a different place than almost any other type of substance that we have on the market, with maybe the possible exceptions of nicotine products and tobacco products, and also nowadays recreational medical marijuana. Alcohol is a substance that, even though we have a lot of laws around who can consume it and at what age, it is one of the most widely, if not the most widely available substance on the market. And it is really incredible to think, when you do stop to think about it, just how prevalent it is in our society and how incredibly interesting it is to try and avoid it. You know, for those of us who are here in Boston, for instance, there are alcohol advertisements everywhere on billboards. There are liquor stores on just about every other corner. There are just so many aspects of alcohol thrown into, you know, especially our sports events, you know, and the bar culture. It's just, there is so much alcohol around us all the time. And even if we were to isolate ourselves at home, it's on our TVs, it's on our social media, it's on our YouTube commercials. It is literally everywhere. It is inescapable. And again, we're gonna talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on in the course of the presentation. And again, just wanted to point out that there is no one reason why an individual might end up struggling with an addiction to a substance. There are so many more than just exist on this one slide. Which kind of leads us into the topic of alcohol and mental health. So some of the most common substance use issues that are tied to mental health diagnoses. We see mental health in the light of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and other trauma diagnoses, and also especially bipolar disorder. However, again, just want to clarify here very quickly, again, having a mental health diagnosis does not mean that you're guaranteed to develop any kind of substance use disorder. You can have one, you can have the other, you can have both. It is very dependent on the individual. However, like we pointed out in our last slide, there are definitely a lot of things that could really appeal to someone who may be trying to self-medicate their alcohol in order to avoid or to try and just deal with living with any number of different issues or problems in their life. I really like this little slide right over here because it kind of shows this kind of really, sadly, just kind of chronic cycle that we can get into. You know, let's say we have a moment of anxiety, we have that drink to relax, we start to feel better for a little while because again, we have in our minds, oh, you know, there's this little stimulant kick that's gonna happen and I'm gonna feel better. And then eventually, again, the depressive nature of alcohol really shows itself. And those happy kind of chemicals that are in our brains get depleted, which leads again to an increase in our anxiety, and then so on and so forth, drinking to feel better, stop feeling better, you start to feel worse again, you drink to relax, and it just, again, it's really just a continuous and often tragic cycle that we can really get locked into. So one of the other things that I want to talk about especially are some of the medical consequences of alcohol use. One of the things that we definitely need to think about is how especially alcohol is impacting the brain. So we have two different brain imaging scan images up here. We have a brain scan on this side of an adult comparison, and then on this other side right here on the right, we have some visual scans of the teenage brain. I'm going to start with the adult section right over here. So this is an MRI scan of a normal, healthy, functioning 43-year-old adult brain. And right next to it is the brain of another adult, same age, but of someone who has been struggling with chronic alcohol use. And you can see here, obviously, there is a lot more of this kind of gray-blue material right here on the left of the healthy brain. And there are so many just gaps and dark spaces on the side of the alcoholic's brain. There's a huge reason for that. And it's not something that is going to happen overnight. This is something that very much develops over the course of very heavy chronic drinking. But essentially, to give a little biology lesson here, our brain has millions and millions and millions of tiny little messengers called neurons. And these neurons form kind of informational highways that tell our brain and our body pretty much all of the information that we gather and need to use over the course of our entire lifetimes. And that is both in terms of biological functioning, like, hey, this is how you need to do X, Y, and Z in order for our lungs and heart to keep pumping, to, hey, this is what traffic signals mean when you're driving your car. Neurons contain all of that information and more. And when we are looking at the picture of a normal human brain, which some of you may have seen, you'll notice that there are all of these different, very thick areas of just kind of look like lines on the human brain. And then if you've ever looked at the brain of someone who has been struggling with alcohol use for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, you start to notice that the brain almost seems a little bit smaller. And not only smaller, but those lines that we normally think of when we think of the picture of a human brain, those lines are much, much smaller. They may be gone completely. That is because chronic alcohol abuse actually kills off those very important neurons in our brain. And unfortunately, when you get to a certain point, there is no coming back, there is no recovery from that. That is something that we refer to as Korsakoff's syndrome, which is also known on the street very commonly as wet brain, because the brain at that point literally just looks like a blank, empty lump of wet clay. All of the neurons are gone. And again, like I said, unfortunately, we have no cure. We have some treatment that we have developed for Korsakoff's, but not enough to reverse the incredible amount of damage that alcohol dependency will do to the human brain. I have worked with a couple of people who have had early onset Korsakoff syndrome, and they are in some ways the lucky ones because they were able to catch themselves just before things got truly, truly bad. And even if you do manage to stop drinking and stay sober for the rest of your adult life at that point, there are still going to be issues potentially with speech in terms of slurring, body balance and motor control with your movements. I have seen some people with Korsakoff's disease who were completely stone cold sober, who looked as though they were just raging drunk. And that is unfortunately the result of, again, all of those neurons being killed in the course of alcohol dependency. Now, even though we don't necessarily have to worry about that with the teenage or young adult brain, there are definitely a lot of immediate impacts of heavy drinking on the teenage brain that we can't ignore here. We have on this side a 15-year-old non-drinker comparing to a 15-year-old heavy drinker. You can see here, so this basically, these images were taken via MRI during a working memory test. You can see that when the 15-year-old non-drinker was doing this test, they had many, many different parts of their brain being activated. That's what all of these kind of pink and red and yellow spots on the brain indicate. Whereas with the 15-year-old heavy drinker, you have just that one little aspect of pink kind of showing up right here, kind of towards the frontal area of the brain. So there is a lot of indication that even again, though we're not looking at that same level of just brain deformity happening at the adult level, even with teenagers, there are a lot of consequences to heavy drinking that we definitely should not and cannot ignore for a variety of different reasons. And there are a lot of other things that happen on other parts of the body as well. So the risk, again, of chronic misuse of alcohol, we are looking at a variety of different issues: mouth and throat cancer, jaundice, liver cirrhosis, which is probably more commonly known as scarring of the liver, which can eventually lead to liver cancer, pancreatitis, gastrointestinal diseases, actually, because all of that alcohol is really doing a number on your gut, heart disease, high blood pressure, and I don't think we think about these two necessarily as often, but a weakened immune system and malnutrition. One of the things that happens very commonly with people who are struggling with very heavy alcohol use is they pretty much stop eating food, and they are predominantly relying on alcohol as their main form of substance to keep them going during the day. If we're only drinking alcohol, it doesn't matter what type of alcohol it is, and we're not eating other types of food, we are losing out on very, very important things for our health: protein, carbohydrates, and different vitamins especially. And that can definitely lead to, again, a lot of immune weakening and also immune system weakening, and again, gastrointestinal and esophageal issues. So if you are someone who is already struggling with especially any sort of liver conditions, any heart conditions, if you are someone who is at high risk of developing high blood pressure due to maybe a family genetic history of it, if you are also someone who has a history in your family of different types of cancer, alcohol can definitely worsen your risk factor. So it's something that's really important to take into account if you are in fact really struggling with substance use. A couple of other things that we also tend to think of that are slightly less common, but for instance, you might have noticed, if you have ever seen someone struggling with alcohol use, that their skin seems to be actually incredibly yellow. You might also notice the same thing happening with their eyes. You might also notice that you might be having a lot more difficulties with having sex, because alcohol dependency can actually lead to the deterioration not only of your testicles, but it can also reduce fertility in both men and women, as well as sometimes leading to just a total decrease in your libido and just straight out impotence in some cases. Now, here is something else that we had talked about a little bit earlier in the presentation that I also really want to go into today, because this is so incredibly important. And that is that alcohol is a substance from which you can experience something called withdrawal, meaning that as your body basically is, for whatever reason, the alcohol levels are slowly going down because you're not putting any more alcohol into it. So withdrawal, especially with alcohol, with opiates, and with, I would argue, say, cocaine and a few other stimulants, it can be incredibly dangerous. With alcohol withdrawal, in the first, sometimes even within the first 6 hours of not having any alcohol entering your body, we are seeing a huge increase in levels of anxiety, insomnia, irritability, and also potential possibility of seizures, which is one of the reasons why we so strongly encourage people, if you are struggling with substance use, especially alcohol substance use, do not quit cold turkey, because if your body goes into that kind of cold turkey mode of, oh, all of a sudden there's no alcohol here, that in turn can really activate a lot of the, this is a biology lesson I don't have time to do justice to today, but not having that alcohol can really mess with the electromagnetic fields that are actually part of your brain. And basically those electrical fields get a little bit too charged and too activated, which is actually what normally leads to seizures with people who have epilepsy. But in this case, with alcohol, it can cause a very, very similar effect. And an alcohol withdrawal seizure can be fatal. Again, this does not have to be fatal if you get yourself into a medical facility to be put into a safe environment to go through medical withdrawal in the proper treatment process. But if you are on your own, again, that is definitely a very, very high risk factor. And then the longer that you go on for, the worse the symptoms tend to get. Auditory and visual hallucinations, shaking, sweating. Again, your heart starts to just pump faster and faster and faster. Your body temperature starts to go up. Again, you may even begin to experience, more illusions, delirium, high blood pressure, fever, just constant sweating. So again, very important that alcohol withdrawal symptoms be treated within a safe medical environment. Now, I think this is something that we've talked about in a couple of other trainings that we've done, but there is also something called post-acute withdrawal symptom, which we often shorten to PAWS. So PAWS is a set of symptoms that actually can occur after withdrawal. So withdrawal, typically, if you are in an emergency room, you are going to be probably transitioning out of the emergency room and hopefully into a higher level of inpatient care for your substance use after probably no more than, I'd say, 1 to 3 days in most cases. Again, I'm going to stop here really quickly, and I just want to ask people, how long do you think your body needs to recover after you've gone through that initial detox process? How long do you think that timeline looks like? And again, I'm just going to give people a couple of seconds to answer that in our chat box. Okay, I'm seeing one person saying 6 weeks. Okay. I have another person who's just said 4 weeks. I have another person saying a week, week and a half. And I have another person who just popped in as well. They say 2 to 4 months. Okay, so the answer to that is that it could really be any of those time frames, but actually, post-acute withdrawal is something that can last for a couple of weeks. It could last 6 months. It could even last up to a year. And while you are going through post-acute withdrawal symptoms, there are so many different symptoms that you are going to be experiencing as your body goes through that slow, gradual healing process. Just because you no longer have alcohol flowing in your body doesn't mean that all of the damage that you've caused to yourself is going to go away overnight. Your liver needs time to heal. Your throat and your esophageal lining need time to heal. Your brain, and we just talked a few slides ago about how much alcohol impacts the brain. Your brain needs so much time to heal. And that really does depend on how long you've been drinking, dependently for how often you've been drinking, what you've been drinking. There are a lot of different factors that go into how long this can last for. But this is also one of the reasons why getting into detox and going through that initial process of just no longer having alcohol in your body is just the first step in a very, very long journey. So I kind of poked ahead a little bit there in this slide, but I just want to ask again the audience, what are some symptoms that you think might be part of that whole recovery period? What do you think that might cause in people? We have 2 different answers right down here, actually. Cravings definitely is a big one, and depression is also another one. But again, anyone else have any other thoughts about what other symptoms might look like? Okay, I'm seeing one person tuning in and saying that they think anxiety could definitely be a symptom. Yeah, absolutely. And then I'm seeing one person saying mood swings, ? Yeah, definitely also that as well. Okay, let me just give people a couple more seconds. Okay, not seeing a whole lot of other answers. So let's get into that list. Irritability is definitely a huge one. Mood swings, just as someone else mentioned. Difficulties with focus and concentration is another really huge one. And again, we had just talked about how the brain needs all of that time to heal. Focus and concentration is definitely something that comes from the brain, and it is something that is going to take time in order for you to go back to how you were functioning before you were starting to struggle with alcohol. Insomnia is actually a really big problem. I would say at least 90% of every single client who I've ever worked with who has been struggling with alcohol use has struggled with insomnia. More rarely, I have seen people struggling with hypersomnia, which is the fancy way of saying that you just can't stop sleeping. You just want to sleep all day long. Then we also have hypervigilance. You're not necessarily paranoid to the point where you are having, just unrealistic thoughts about things, but you definitely startle very easily. You're kind of on guard a lot more religiously. An inability to deal with stressors, and by stressors, that again could look very different from person to person, but a lot of very common ones could be everything from work and school to stressful interactions with other people to, an inability to deal with maybe health issues that you've neglected while abusing alcohol, difficulties with decision making. This is definitely another huge one as well. Oops, popped ahead a little bit too early there. So this is one of the reasons why we actually, and we'll get to this in a few more slides, this is one of the reasons, especially for substance use, that we have such a long treatment process if someone is going through kind of the traditional steps after detox, because the first 6 to 12 months after completely putting down a substance, you're having to deal with all of this. And mind you, going into detox and going through those initial withdrawal symptoms is one of the most unpleasant things that a human being can possibly experience. And then imagine, you go from that and then you go into a 6 to 12 month period where everything is just so difficult and it is such a legitimate struggle. And you're also having to probably at that point rebuild a lot of different areas of your life. That could be trying to rebuild family relationships. That could be trying to rebuild your credit and your financial history. That could be trying to resolve being homeless. That could be trying to resolve different legal situations that might have popped up. And to be trying to deal with all of that on top of staying sober, and then also having to go through possibly all of these different things all at the same time, it's difficult. So in terms of that treatment timeline, again, we have the initial emergency room admission. You have to be cleared, at least in Massachusetts, by an emergency room doctor before you can be admitted to a higher level of substance use treatment. So that could be anywhere from a couple of hours to sometimes 24 to 72 hours. It also depends on if you are developing any signs of risk of having any type of withdrawal seizure. But let's say you've gone to the ED, you've been cleared medically, then you go to detox, you spend another 5 or 10 days at the hospital level of care, kind of again, just slowly getting rid of all of the alcohol in your body. Then you go on to another sort of program, which is a little bit more residential based, which would be a TSS or a CSS program, which would be basically a clinical stabilization program. And that is typically a program where you are, again, like I said, you're in a very residential setting at the hospital level. You are doing individual therapy. You are doing a lot of group work. You're probably having to go to AA meetings that are coming in to do what we call commitments. But basically, it's very intensive treatment. I would say typically most people are at TSS, CSS programs for about 2 to 4 weeks, sometimes longer than that. And really, that's just the stepping stone to the next aspect of the traditional treatment timeline. Not everybody chooses to do this, but typically the next step after that would be going to what we call a halfway house or some sort of smaller residential program. I would say for most of the adult programs that I've either worked at or have had clients go to, you typically have about anywhere from 20 to 30, no more than I would say 40 people living in a house that is no longer at the hospital typically, but is usually somewhere out in the community. Most people end up staying at the residential program for about 3 to 6 months. And this is really the time period where people are slowly, hopefully starting to eventually, now that they've had all of that time to really medically get cleared and heal, they're now focusing on other really important aspects of life, like getting back into the job market again, starting to rebuild, social supports and recovery supports. Some programs, after you complete a residential program like a halfway house have a little something called a graduate house, which is basically a much smaller home that is usually in a neighborhood somewhere that usually you don't have more than, I'd say, 8 or so people living at this. And this is for people who have done very well at the halfway house level but just need a little bit more time to just kind of get back up on their feet. Maybe they're going through a very complicated legal or medical situation, for instance. Most graduate houses probably will let you stay there about, again, 3 to 6 months or so. And more commonly, you also have sober houses. Some people skip the residential program entirely because this is a very treatment intensive process, and they go immediately to the sober house, which is a little bit more of just a kind of almost like a boarding house. Although you are expected to remain sober, there may be meetings that you're expected to go to, especially like Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, but it's not nearly as intensive as your traditional halfway house. And then after you've gone through all of that, which can take, as you can see here, anywhere from half a year to a full year, then there's the long-term sobriety maintenance that you are going to have to work at for literally the rest of your life. And that could be Alcoholics Anonymous meetings or Smart Recovery meetings. There's medication-assisted therapy, where basically you might be staying on a certain medication in an effort to try and help with staying sober. There's individual and group therapy. You may end up going into family or couples therapy. You might eventually go back to spiritual or faith-based activities if that is something that is part of your life, etc., etc. And this is really where, you know, we also have to talk a lot about the difference between sobriety versus recovery. Also want to make a quick little note that the length of stay in treatment may be very dependent on your insurance coverage. Someone who has Blue Cross Blue Shield, for instance, might be able to stay in treatment a lot longer than someone who, say, has Mass Health insurance and has a limit on how much, you know, Mass Health is willing to pay in terms of them staying at detox, for instance, or at a CSS program. Sobriety versus recovery. This is something that I talk about quite a bit with a lot of my clients, and also with a lot of the family members and loved ones of my clients who sometimes will come in to do family work with me. So what do people think is the big difference between sobriety and recovery? And again, I'm just going to give people a second or two to go into the chat box. Okay, I have one person saying sobriety is to be completely sober of all substances, and recovery is kind of, again, getting over post-acute withdrawal and just kind of trying to restabilize in your life. Yeah, okay, yeah, that's definitely a lot of what we had talked about in the last couple of slides. Very true. Anybody else? Okay. Whoops, I don't know why I just did that. So if we look at the technical formal definitions here, sobriety is the state of being absolutely and completely sober. Recovery is a return to a normal state of health and wellness, or the process of regaining possession or control over something that was lost. As we just saw in our last slide, obviously, the journey to sobriety is quite complicated and quite long. The journey of recovery is often a very, very individual and emotional process. Like I said earlier, there are a lot of different reasons for why someone may end up turning to alcohol as their main coping skill. I have definitely done a lot of work with clients, and I would say both in terms of not just alcohol, but the majority of people who I have worked with who have had a substance use issue. I'd say about easily 80 to 85% of them came to me with a definite diagnosis of post-traumatic stress. Trauma makes up a huge part of addiction, and a lot of this trauma that happens even before you start to use. And unfortunately, for many people that I have worked with in the past, we're talking about very early onset childhood or young adult trauma. Recovery is really sobriety plus you having to really learn how to sit with your own self again and being comfortable in your own skin. It's about no longer just living with this idea that your whole identity is only wrapped up around the things that have to do with either alcohol or what led you to abusing that alcohol in the first place. So that is definitely something that takes a considerable period of time to work on and develop and to gain supports to help you through that part of your journey. But it is definitely one of the most important aspects of treatment. Now, just to keep this a little bit Somerville focused, and I do realize I'm running a little bit behind tonight. We're already at 6:57, so if people need to hop off, I totally understand. But when it comes to City of Somerville, according to the most recent data that we have from the high school, 60% of students report that they've never had alcohol before, which is way below a lot of other local municipalities, and it's way below a lot of the national statistics that we have for youth substance use. So go Somerville, we have a lot of really, really smart kids who know to stay away from substances. And again, that is just lifetime use. In terms of active current use of alcohol, 83% of those same students reported that they aren't drinking at all right now, period. So again, we are looking at a huge majority of our youth who are making that decision to just not drink alcohol. And again, same thing with our middle schoolers as well. And this is from our last middle school data report from 2017-2018. You have 86% of students who are reporting that they've never drank alcohol before. Obviously, though, we would like to have these numbers a lot closer to the 90 percentile mark, maybe even eventually one day the 100 percentile mark. But that is, again, something that we need to do a lot of work on now. One of the challenges to that, and I unfortunately do not think I have time today to show this, but if you have the time afterwards, if you're looking at this again, this will be posted to YouTube. Feel free to check out this other YouTube link. And it's really just to kind of break it down to all of you. It's not anything particularly special, but it is a very short alcohol company commercial for a beer company, I believe. And one of the things that we have to think about when it comes to alcohol advertisement in this country is that it is very much regulated by the alcohol industry, whether we're talking about the Budweiser Clydesdales or, people, popping open a cold beer on a rooftop deck. I guess like the most recent thing that's very popular right now is like White Claw and spritzers. All of these commercials showing, just all of these these huge groups of people who are all young and attractive, who are, just totally having a great time and having a drink, and it's a very casual thing. And typically you have in very, very tiny print at the bottom of a lot of these commercials, oh, you must be, 21 years and older to drink, da 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 da. But at the end of the day, again, we don't have necessarily a whole lot of control over what the alcohol industry is doing when it comes to really kind of promoting this idea that alcohol is a substance that can really in a lot of ways be used without consequence. And as we can see here at this slide, there are a lot of consequences attached to it. We are currently losing about, and this is on a global level, mind you, about 3.3 million people every single year from alcohol-related deaths. That's 6 deaths a minute. And that's about, a third of those individuals are women and 2/3 of those individuals are men. And we are seeing all sorts of different issues related to this: fetal alcohol syndrome, suicide, domestic or interpersonal violence, traffic injuries, and then again, a lot of these same medical conditions that we had talked about a little bit earlier. For the US, we currently have about 93,000 people dying from excessive alcohol use every single year. And to break that down into a daily number, we have 255 people dying every single day, again, due to that excessive alcohol use. Now, one of the reasons why we are talking about all of this in conjuncture with one another is that youth exposure to advertisement of alcohol is so important, especially because youth are very successfully targeted via advertising, more so than adults actually in some ways, especially through, and some of these are probably more prevalent than others, television and film, popular music, even billboards, the radio, and especially again the internet with YouTube, social media, etc. And there are so many different reasons for why this is the case, but Again, we unfortunately do not have the time tonight to get into all of them, but needless to say, youth exposure to advertisements is a major factor of why a youth might get exposed to alcohol and consider it to be an attractive option for themselves. Another really interesting thing that I pulled from some of the research I was doing from this is that youth are actually more likely to consume a brand that they've had more exposure to than others, which is, not related to alcohol, but this is one of the reasons why I think Juul eventually became such a popular thing amongst our young people, because it was so heavily promoted and it was so heavily marketed and advertised. Again, with a lot of our youth, especially in Somerville, if anyone has ever seen any of the NIPET programs that we have done via my manager, Matt Mitchell, we'll see that, overwhelmingly the amount of that the alcohol that we're seeing on the street in terms of the empty bottles are Smirnoff bottles, like those tiny little nip Smirnoffs that are flavored vodka drinks. So that is a brand that definitely gets a lot of advertisement, and that's one of the reasons why we actually do the NIPET trash program every single year, as a means of trying to, again, reduce that amount of youth exposure to those bottles. But really, there are a lot of other different things that we can do here. Again, whether that is limiting the amount of places that are serving and selling alcohol, especially in areas where minors might be super prevalent, to, just having people being really responsible about checking IDs at different events that are serving alcohol, reducing, again, local youth exposure to alcohol advertising, and raising awareness in schools and health classes, reducing and limiting the amount of alcohol you can drink in public parks and public spaces and concert venues and just other places where, again, there are a lot of people gathered around. And also, again, just education, and just, whether that is happening from a parent talking to their child or your pediatrician or your doctor talking to you about the risks of alcohol use. The more we talk about it, the more that we get youth, and frankly, a lot of adults, to see the risks associated with alcohol use, the more successful that we are overall going to be at reducing youth substance use in our community. Now, I have a lot of different resources here, actually. I think more so than almost any other of the training presentations that I've posted so far this summer. But the biggest one that we want to point out to people is the Massachusetts State Helpline. You can call them at 1-800-327-5050. They also have a fantastic website that you can actually look up different treatment options for yourself or for a loved one. Another really great educational resource, I would say, would be SAMHSA, or the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration. Their website has another treatment directory as well. In terms of more traditional group meetings, whether that be Alcoholics Anonymous or Smart Recovery, we have a couple of different virtual options available here. Obviously, Smart Recovery and Alcoholics Anonymous have a very large presence in terms of having in-person meetings normally, but considering the state of the pandemic right now, they've shifted pretty much everything online. smartrecovery.org has a lot of really great meetings, AA Intergroup, AA Chats, In the Rooms, the Heron Project, the Recovery Dharma online website I've mentioned in another presentation earlier a couple weeks ago, but that is a Buddhist-focused recovery center that you can also, find different groups for around substance use recovery. And again, please keep in mind that all of these are for our adults. If you are a youth, I will say that we unfortunately have seen a major reduction in our youth substance use programs throughout the whole state. There are a lot of different reasons for that again, I unfortunately do not have the time to do justice to tonight, but there are still a couple of really fantastic programs out there. I would say, again, probably the best option that you could do would be to call the state helpline, or again, get in touch with SAMHSA. We do actually have a recovery high school located here in Boston as well. This is the William J. Ostagai Recovery High School, which is basically an alternative high school for youth who are struggling specifically with substance use. It is a fantastic resource that we have. They are always open to referrals. In fact, a lot of these recovery high schools are shutting down because I feel like nobody knows that they exist, but they do exist out there. We have one right down by Downtown Crossing. That is one potential alternative option for your students if you have any kids in your life who are struggling. We also have a residential program in Boston, and specifically over in Southie. The Cushing House, they have one for boys, one for girls. And again, that is probably one of the last residential programs that we have in the metropolitan area of Boston, but it is a program that is quite good, and I can definitely recommend it to interested parties. And if you are also the parent of a youth, we have a couple of other resources listed down here as well. We have one here that is from Boston Public Health Commission, and we also have a really great article from drugfree.org about how to connect with your teen around talking about substance use. And then just a couple of other different references. I can particularly recommend this last one down here. This is a training that actually what my manager did a few weeks ago, which is specifically alcohol policy in the time of COVID. So something that's obviously very much on everyone's minds right now. Can definitely recommend looking that up. I think that the PDF of that is available online. If not, you can always email us and we can definitely send that to you if you would like to take a look at it. But all in all, again, I think I'm supposed to have a Q&A slide here, which seems to have vanished. I'm so sorry about that. But before I go into that, again, we're always looking for feedback. Please feel free to go to this link down here below, which is https://bit.ly/prevention trainings. This literally takes like a minute to fill out, and we really are looking for community feedback on how we can make these presentations even better. Or maybe it was just terrible and I can get a lot of great feedback about how I can just improve it, period. But again, any sort of feedback would be super welcome. We really want to gear these towards what the community is interested in. So again, please let us know. And then again, please feel free to follow us on our social media. And again, we're going to be doing a lot more postings here on our YouTube channel in the future, so please keep your eye out for that. I will also mention that, slightly unrelated to alcohol, but next Monday, August 31st, is International Overdose Awareness Day. So we will be doing some programming around that. And then September is Recovery Month, and that's a little bit more in general for different types of substances, but we are going to be focusing on opiates in particular. We will be doing a huge social media informational campaign of that. So again, please check out all of our social media throughout the month of September. And now that I have done all of that advertising again, I'm going to just go quiet for a second here and see if there's anyone who has any questions that I didn't quite get to today, or anything that anyone maybe just has some curiosity around. Please feel free to shoot me any questions right now in the chat box. And again, while you're doing that, thank you all for staying with me so late. I know we're about almost about 10 minutes past the time we were supposed to be done. Okay. Well, I'm not seeing anything popping up in the chat box, but again, if you have any questions, again, you can reach out to us via our social media. You can also go onto our website and find our contact information there. I will give out my email actually right now, which is kvauGhan@somervillema.gov. And you can email me any questions that you might have, especially if you are looking for some sort of assistance with just getting more access to information and education. And again, just want to say thank you all so very much. It has been really fantastic and interesting being able to do this training series over the course of this month. And we hope that it was helpful for folks. Again, please give us feedback. Let us know what we can do to improve in the future. We have a couple of different other programming ideas coming up for the remainder of 2020. So hopefully we will be sending out more information about that on our social media very soon. And especially thank you all for being present for training so late. I know that even though we are all pretty much at home at the moment, you know, this is kind of a late night thing. So again, thank you all so much for being participants in this. And just please continue to make sure that you are all staying safe right now in the course of everything that is going on in the world. So again, please feel free to reach out to me, but if we don't have any other questions, I will stop for today and just say again, thank you so much, and please have a great night.